This is the Triumph Scrambler 400X, and I was lucky enough to get my hands on one for a full day's test ride thanks to Triumph Belcatta. How does it handle the highway? And is it style over function like so many other scramblers on the market? And the biggest one of all, is it a low-key adventure bike? Let's find out. It's a liquid-cooled single-cylinder EFI motor. It's roughly 400 cc's or 398.15 cc's if you're pedantic. It's making 40 horsepower and 37.5 newton meters of torque, which is a decent amount. Of course, it's got a 6-speed gearbox for the modern era, a 1917 wheel combo, which is a really nice setup. It gives you a little bit of versatility, which we'll talk about a little later in the video. Brakes, you're getting a 320mm disc up front with a single 4-piston caliper with ABS and a 230mm disc at the back with a single piston caliper, also of course with ABS. Suspension wise, we've got non-adjustable suspension up front with 43mm forks with 150mm of travel. The same amount of travel at the rear at 150mm, but you do get preload adjustability at the back. So this does mean if you're carrying a passenger or you put a little bit of luggage on the back, you are going to be able to adjust that rear suspension. We've got a 13-litre tank, and the bike comes in at a rather impressive 179 kilograms of wet. And for the height challenged out there, we have a seat height of 835mm. That's the specifications in a nutshell. We could dive into far more detail, but let's be honest, the basics of the bike are the most important. Let's talk about what it's actually like to ride. Let's start with the engine, because I've got a lot of questions asking me, is that 400cc motor enough for the everyday rider? And I'm happy to say, yes, it is enough. It depends on what your definition of enough is, of course, but I think it's a great little motor. It's got enough out on the highway to sit at 100 kilometers an hour without breaking a sweat, and plenty left in the tank to take over cars without having to book 6 weeks in advance like some 250s I've owned in the past. As far as vibes go coming from the little motor, it actually isn't all that bad for a single cylinder. With a single cylinder motor, vibrations is just a fact of life. But I'm happy to say that the vibrations are on par with the KTM 390. So the vibrations only really become intrusive once you're really revving out the motor. Above 110 kilometers an hour or 70 miles per hour if you're in the US, it is certainly noticeable. So if you're planning for really long distance riding at high speeds, then perhaps this isn't the bike for you, but that's not this bike's intended purpose, so you can't really fault it too much for that. I was really impressed with this motor. Taking off, it's super smooth, and that's not always my experience in the modern day with EFI. There isn't any quirks when you're taking off. You don't have to be funny with the clutch. It doesn't have a strange release point. It's all very natural and intuitive, which is exactly what you want in this class when it's going to be a bike for a learner, a returning rider. That motor has a nice lumpy bit of torque that really makes it easy to take off, and it's very difficult to stall. So I really enjoyed that little engine. I was surprised also at how much character it had, because often these little single cylinders can lack a little bit of character, but the exhaust note that Triumph have managed to eke out of this bike in the stock form isn't too bad, so it was pleasant to ride. It has a nice little bit of a brap to it. I think that motor is going to be quite a surprise for a lot of people. Now, of course, it's never going to compete with a parallel twin 270-degree crank that sounds absolutely amazing. If that's your thing, then this motor isn't going to stack up to that sound. But if you're worried about the single cylinder sounding like a sewing machine, I think with this bike, especially with a pipe on it, it's going to sound pretty damn good. Think kind of 450 dirt bike kind of brappage sound. If you're into that, then you're really going to like the sound of this motor.
Like this. Nice and nimble, straight up in the middle. And everyone in America will be screaming about it. You can't split.
Yeah, you flagged on it at the supermarket.
Yep, you can't split.
You do have to be a little bit careful about what gear you're in, given it is a 400cc bike. So if you're putting along at slow speeds and you're in a high gear, it isn't going to have quite enough if you twist the throttle to zip into traffic. If you need to be quick about it, you do need to be in the right gear. Next up is brakes. This bike probably is going to be doing commuting duties for a lot of people, and random people are going to slam on their brakes without warning. So you need to know whether these things can stop on a dime. This little scrambler is very confidence inspiring with the braking. It certainly isn't the most powerful braking setup I've ever experienced on a motorcycle, but it is at the value orientated end of the spectrum. And I thought it did an adequate job. I would compare it to bikes like Honda's CB500X in brake feel. The brakes felt progressive. I understood what they were doing. I didn't feel like if I grabbed too much, I was going to be losing the front wheel. I was riding in some pretty crappy wet and windy weather, so the brakes really did a good job. I was never worried about losing that front end under load. Now you do notice that it doesn't have braided lines, so it does have that old familiar squidge. It was definitely a good experience. I didn't find this bike under braked at all, and I think it will stand up easily to commuting duties when you're on and off the brakes pretty hard all day. The suspension never stood out to me in a way that I really noticed and thought, oh, you know what, that's horrible. It took everything in its stride. Of course, this was only road riding, so I didn't get to experience this off-road. Triumph just wouldn't let me do that, so I do apologize, but my hands were tied. But on the road, on our famously terrible roads here in Australia, it soaked up all the bumps and all the massive potholes, the speed bumps and the cobbled roads in Fremantle perfectly. I thought it did a really good job of handling a spectrum of riding. It felt confident in the corners, tipping it in handling wise. I think the suspension is going to be adequate for most people. The only quibble I would have liked to seen is a little more adjustability in the stock suspension, but at this value end of the spectrum, those are the kinds of things you expect to see cut.
You know, we complain about our setup being a lot of faff, you know.
Oh man, yeah.
Can you imagine getting all that kit onto you?
Yeah.
Now, linking into the suspension, the handling, which I did talk about briefly, I thought the handling was really predictable. It didn't feel like the sharpest motorcycle that you absolutely carve up the twisties like a super sport, but it definitely felt really nimble, really flickable. It was happy to tip into corners. It didn't have any odd quirks to it either. I found the Triumph Scrambler 900 that I rode really wanted to tuck in the front wheel when you're dipping it into a corner. It was really quite disconcerting, and I absolutely hated the feeling. I'm happy to say the Scrambler 400X doesn't share that DNA, so this was a very predictable bike to ride. I just hopped on the bike and it felt like an old pair of shoes fitting me perfectly, and I didn't have to put too much thought into it. So I thought the handling was really nice, feels nimble through traffic, but planted enough in the corners to have a bit of fun. So I think this will be equally good as a commuter and carving it up in the twisties with your mates on the weekend.
Yeah. Nice day for it.
Now we get to the other big category I like to talk about, and that's the aesthetics. Now, aesthetics wise, I thought this is a pretty nice looking motorcycle, I've got to say. Even next to my mate's custom XSR 900, this looked really nice and it wasn't outshone too badly. Now, admittedly, the tank on my mate's XSR 900 is absolutely beautiful, so it gets a lot of looks. This little Scrambler really held its own and looked right at home in the middle of Fremantle, which if you're in Europe is kind of like Western Australia's Old Town. So it's where everyone goes with their nice cars, nice motorcycles to pull up at the pubs and cafes and show off, and it really felt at home there. This looks like a far more premium motorcycle than the price would really suggest. Now, if you put it up alongside a Triumph Scrambler 1200, you definitely can see that there is a distinct quality differential there. The quality in the far more expensive 1200s is just otherworldly compared to this, but I think for the price, they've done a really good job of maximizing the aesthetics of this motorcycle. And lastly, let's talk about the comfort of the bike. How does it feel to sit on? How comfortable is it? Well, let's start with the seat, which was surprisingly comfortable. Often a seat can make or break your riding experience of a bike, and it can be an expensive upgrade to get something far more comfortable, which is a real shame at this end of the market where you're really trying to save every penny you can. So this stock seat was really, really good. Now I do need to put in a caveat that I didn't ride this bike super long distances out into the countryside, but I was in the seat for 30 to 45 minute sessions at a time, and I didn't feel uncomfortable at any point. So I thought the seat did an adequate job of keeping me comfortable. And that's not always been my experience on Scramblers, where they do tend to sacrifice comfort for aesthetics a lot of the time. The very upright seating position, a neutral seating position, I found this very comfortable. It's my preferred seating position on a motorcycle. I didn't feel too cramped. I'm a little bit over 180 centimeters and I didn't feel cramped at all. My friend who also was along for the ride, he had a go on the bike as well, and he's about 187 centimeters and also didn't complain about the bike being too cramped.
Right, back home with a soggy ass.
What didn't I like about this? I was paying far more attention to the digital readout, what gear I was in and the revs. That tended to catch my eye more, and I had to really focus and concentrate in being able to see my speed. It really was a little bit busy and a little bit of a distraction. I would have loved to have seen them either go for an old school analog display or a completely digital display. I think this halfway house is just a little bit of a niggle. Shifting from first to second and second to third was quite a clunky experience. The bike does lurch a bit unless you are really concentrating on keeping it smooth. Brake lever and the foot pegs became very slippery, and I had to pay a lot of attention to keeping my feet in the right spot because they did slip off quite easily, so that was really frustrating.
Spiderwebs on my bike.
Right, yeah, off-road pro. Get it in one go.
I did want to touch on two questions I got from heaps of viewers. I put it out to you, what do you want to know most about this motorcycle before I hopped on it for the first time? And the two most asked questions about this bike was, what was it like at highway speeds and what is its off-road capability? So what were the highway characteristics like? Well, it sits happily at 100 kilometers an hour. That's roughly 60 miles per hour, maybe 65 miles per hour. There wasn't any intrusive buzzing at that speed, nothing was coming through the foot pegs, as well as nothing too intrusive was coming through the handlebars. And in sixth gear, if you twist the throttle, it's got enough power to get around traffic and zip in and out of lanes, which is something that's really important. Now, once you do hit 110 kilometers an hour, which I wasn't able to do consistently because I would have had to ridden much further out of the city, but I did get to hit it a couple of times on the highway quickly. But right at about the 110, it wasn't too intrusive. You definitely do notice it, it is there. I think if you were thinking of this bike as a regular long distance tourer, the vibes certainly are something you might want to test for yourself. Take it on a long ride if the dealership will let you, because they're definitely there. Let's talk about the off-road here. I'll be frank, Triumph were not letting me take this off-road at all. How do I think it would go off-road if I was able to take it though? And to answer the question that so many of you had is, can this bike be a low-key left-of-field adventure bike? Can you really have your cake and eat it too? Because this bike looks fantastic and has everything that we love about scramblers looks-wise, but it also has the potential to be an adventure bike. And the short answer is yes. I think this really has the potential to be a lightweight adventure tourer, much like the KTM 390 Adventure or Honda's CB500X. It's got the 19-inch front wheel. You can get the little screen, the panniers and the pannier racks from Triumph's accessory lineup already. It has the comfy seat. You also have that fantastic rider triangle that's nice and upright, just like an adventure bike. And couple that with the fuel tank, which is 13 liters, you'll be getting easily 300 to 350 kilometers to a tank. I think with the right tires, I think this could be a great little adventure bike as long as you're not expecting too much off-roads. So to bring it all together once again, I think for the price, this bike looks pretty damn good. It's also fairly practical, which is not something you often hear people say about a scrambler, and hasn't been my experience in the past either. But this would be a great learner motorcycle, a great commuter, or a great bike if you're returning to riding but you want to have something that looks nice yet practical. It is affordable, and that's a very rare combination. So I think that is probably why this little Triumph is going to be pretty popular. And on top of all that, you can dip your toes into the dirt. It's a versatile, practical, and good looking little motorcycle with a few little niggles, but overall for the price, you can't really fault it. If you're looking at one, I'd say go to the dealership, get your leg over one, see for yourself. But I was fairly impressed by this little motorcycle. Once again, I'd like to thank Triumph Belcata for lending me the bike, and also a big thank you to Ben. You were instrumental in this whole process. So don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. And as always, guys, don't forget to stay shiny side up.